There you are. Hey, great to see you. Welcome to Wednesday Night Lecture. Really happy to have all of you here. Just a little bit of background before I pray and turn the mic over to men much smarter than myself. So this whole idea of labor ethics, which is a rising, I think, conversation, not only in our city, but around the world. Sadly, even a theology of justice was lost over the last few hundred years, but I feel about over the last decade or so, there's been a resurgence of followers of Jesus all around the US, and in particular in Western Europe, thinking about this idea of justice and even the calling on God's people to do justice, which is all over the scriptures. And I think our family of churches was even a little bit late to the table, but maybe for the last 5 years or so, we've really been wrestling with this and what does it mean to do justice as the people of God. But then even more recent for some of us is this idea of labor ethics, which in all honesty, about 2 years ago, maybe even a year and a half ago, was not even on my radar. So in my thinking, there was little or no connection between my shopping for Black Friday or Christmas or getting 30% off or buying a new pair of shoes and systematic oppression around the world and fair trade and human trafficking and sex trafficking and slavery and injustice. There was no connection at all in my mind. And sadly, ignorance was bliss. And once you start to wake up to the way that the world actually is, you realize, oh my gosh, there's all sorts of connections. And in order for, the 1% of the world, which we are, to live the way we live, it's all built on the back of cheap labor. And so it's obviously an incredibly complex conversation, and it has all sorts of emotionalism that is often disconnected from fact and is filled with fiction. And so the goal of tonight is not to walk out of here saying, here are the 10 brands that you can buy, and here are the 10 brands you can no longer buy. That's not at all the goal of tonight. And I know a ton of you out here work for Nike. I'm like, don't worry, it's okay. We're not here to make you quit your job or whatever. But on a serious note, the goal for tonight, I think, is a conversation starter for a lot of you, if you've never thought about this before, to get you thinking in that direction, in particular before Christmas. And then for those of us that are wrestling, myself newer to the conversation, but for those of us that are wrestling with this whole idea of labor ethics, to maybe think deeply and think a little bit better. For those of you that are working in retail or for footwear or for fashion or whatever it is, for you to maybe better understand your role as a follower of Jesus in your company and your industry. So that's kind of the heart for tonight. So we asked Dr. Breshears, who is obviously from Western Seminary and is a brilliant theologian, in particular when it comes to justice, and then the lead singer of a rock band, which is just a fantastic combo. Josh Porter is officially one of the smartest men I know, and Josh's thinking on this subject is not mild, but is incredibly good. And Josh has really challenged me and challenged the way that I live and challenged the way that I spend money just by living his life and shooting me an email once in a while. And it's been a really good, uncomfortable, fantastic challenge to my life. And I've actually found a lot of freedom just personally in the last maybe half of a year as I've been thinking about this. A lot of freedom from materialism, which for me is just a huge kind of deep internal struggle. I want more money, I want more stuff, I want to live well. I'm from Portland, right? And I found quite a lot of freedom and even more and more of a genuine, authentic desire to live a life of simplicity the more I learn about this entire idea. So really happy to have you guys here. I'll just pray and then turn it over to you. Is that cool? So Jesus, thanks so much for these two men. Thank you so much, even more so for your heart, for the vulnerable and the voiceless. You're calling on all of your people, from Abraham down to each of us here tonight, to do justice. We're so thankful for that, Jesus. And we just pray for these two men. Would you give them wisdom and skill and intelligence to open the scriptures, to think through issues that are complex and multipolar and all over the stream. And would you shape how we think tonight as a people of God? And then out of that, would you shape how we live? And then out of that, would you maybe even reshape in bits and pieces the city that we call home? Thank you, Jesus. Amen. How about a warm round of applause for these guys, huh?
Thanks, guys. Thank you guys for making the trek out here on what's tonight? Wednesday, on a Wednesday evening. That's awesome. So, as you know, unless something has changed since I started writing this thing, tonight is November 12th, right? November 12th. That's a mere 2 weeks and 2 days before the appropriately named Black Friday. Before the Friday in question actually begins in the literal sense, Consumers will have pitched tents outside of major retailers enduring the cold and maybe even the snow, apparently, I'm told, all in the romantic hope of saving a few dollars on an Xbox. The sacrifice, the endurance, chasing after that impossible dream. Black Friday is a lot like the Olympics in that way, except it's more entertaining. But what isn't? These retailers will open their doors and they'll institute elaborate systems. They'll have tickets and they'll have subcategorized lines and they'll have rain checks and all these different ways for you to get the stuff that you need. And they do this to keep people from dying. Because the fervor that is unleashed from Black Friday anticipation leads to actual stampedes. Honest to God stampedes. It leads to shootings. People die on Black Friday. 'Tis the shopping season. But not everybody brings guns to Best Buy, and a lot of us aren't even remotely willing to walk over another human being to get our hands on a television set. But even so, chances are most of us will shop in the coming months. Most of us will probably shop more than usual. And if we manage to avoid the sort of retail hamster wheel of the holiday season, we will, at some point, buy something. Food, entertainment, clothes. And as most of us, dare I say, all of us, do indeed shop, very few of us are privy to a glance behind the curtain in front of which the products that we buy sit. Where did it come from? How did it get here? What does my purchase support? And it isn't with complete ignorance that we forego a peek behind the curtain. Like John Mark was saying, a lot of us have heard about things like injustice in the labor industry. We know about terms like sweatshop, in which, children are supposedly forced to work grueling hours in deplorable conditions under the awful mastery of slave drivers. We've heard about factories that collapse and kill hundreds of workers. We've heard about women that are trafficked into slavery in front of a sewing machine. But we've also heard other things. This company's bad, but this company's good. This company's bad, but they're not as bad as everyone says. Or this company is better than anybody says. Oh, wait, no, they're not. And on it goes. The industry is inherently flawed. No one can shop without some blood on their hands, so why try at all? And how much of that stuff can we actually even know? Do we even have reasonable access to a glance behind that curtain that I'm talking about? Or is it all hearsay? And if we do acquire any real data, then what? Can or should that information actually affect or change how we shop? For those of us that are disciples of Jesus of Nazareth, the fundamental precept to our apprenticeship to Jesus is that we live out the way of Jesus, that we learn his teachings, that we make the way that he thinks and sees the way that we think and that we see, that we become like Jesus, that we carry on Jesus' work in the world. And this is the presupposition out of which we're working this evening. If our lives are indeed surrendered in their entirety to Jesus of Nazareth, this includes our choices as consumers. The church has, as far as I can tell, been making better strides to speak out against the horrific plague of materialism and consumerism, in particular in the West and America, as it pertains to the way that we handle our money, our greed, our excess, and how that leads to injustice. We've certainly got a long, long way to go, but we've begun that conversation. A conversation, it seems to me, that we've yet to fully broach is what goes on behind our purchases in terms of where they came from and how we, as disciples of Jesus, do or do not adjust the way that we shop in light of this information. But before we elucidate some of the pragmatic nuts and bolts of labor ethics and how we shop and what's really going on in the industry, we thought it would be helpful to establish a biblical paradigm from which to work this evening. And lucky for us, we thankfully have our faithful advisor, Dr. Gerry Breshears. He's a professor, like John Mark said, of theology at Western Seminary, and where he enjoys the privilege of having me as a student. So, Dr. Breshears, can you come tell us a little bit about the biblical idea of justice? I was hoping this would happen, so the student becomes the teacher.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you know the reason that professors are good? You know what makes a good professor? You get guys like him and him to come be your students, and then you can't help but look good. It's great. So yeah, it's very fun. I got into this whole discussion back in 1969. Sherry and I got called by God to do something really foolish and go to the Philippines with a 2-month-old baby and no support and no draft. Anyway, long story. And I got over there and went out in the province in the Philippines, south of Manila, and I saw people living out in the barrio there with houses made largely out of some cheap logs and Dole pineapple cardboard. And I thought, that's not really adequate housing, especially in a place like the Philippines where it just rains like crazy. And I objected. And what I was told was the people who have Dole cardboard siding for their houses are actually way better off than other people who don't have anything to put on their siding. I said, what do you mean? I said, yeah, they're growing pineapples and bananas that go to Dole, and then they're shipped around the world to various places, including the United States. But what they said is these people have jobs that get paid a good wage by the local economy standards. And I thought, I got to think about this. And so that's why when Josh came up and said, I'd like to look at this, I thought, okay, good call. So what I want to do is run through just kind of a basic biblical perspective on what is justice and some of the things specific to oppressing workers and such, just to give you a biblical foundation. Then I'll turn back over to Josh and he'll unpack it, and then we'll have a Q&A time for a little bit. So you got your telephone out? Because this is a Bible time. If you don't, I think there's like all those print things in front of you that you can actually look in the old-fashioned way. Anybody who's been around my classes very long knows that I believe in Abrahamic justice. And I won't expound that, I'll just give you 4 basic points. The 4 basic dimensions of justice or righteousness or shalom in Scripture. Shalom or justice or righteousness as a noun is a community where all relationships, God, others, self, rest of creation, are well-ordered, flourishing as God designed them to be. So what are the 4 dimensions? God, others, self, all the rest of creation. All relationships, it's a community with all relationships, God, others, self, rest of creation, well-ordered, flourishing as God designed it to be. That's the basic definition of justice and righteousness. So if you look in Genesis chapter 12, I see God calling Abram, and he says, go to a land I will show you. And in verse 7, they get to Canaan, and God built an altar there. Are you there yet? Genesis. I'm serious about looking at the Bible. It's one of those good things. To whom did God build an altar in Genesis 12:7? To Yahweh. Who is the God of Canaan? Baal. So when you go to Baal, who should you build an altar to? Baal, because he's the God of that area. What Abram does when he gets to Canaan is he builds an altar to Yahweh. That's an act of defiance and rebellion and loyalty to Yahweh. First dimension of righteousness. Okay? Second dimension of righteousness, chapter 15, Genesis 15. This is 15 years later. God has promised that he'll have a son. God says, I will bless you. And Abram says, how can you bless me? Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? This guy from Damascus is going to be my heir. What's he doing? He's complaining. To whom? To God. Respectfully, don't blog about God, talk to God. And God says, oh, don't worry about it, I'll take care of the details. You know, stars and all that kind of stuff. And then verse 6, what does he do? Genesis 15:6. God, Abram, what? Yeah, the word there is amen. He amened God, which says, I will take you at your word. He believes God. He amens God. He says, it makes no sense to me that an old man and an old woman can have a baby, but I'll trust you that it's true. And God said that kind of faith is righteousness. So first dimension is when you are loyal to Yahweh. Second dimension is when you trust that Yahweh's way is the right way. Loyal to Yahweh, chapter 12. You trust that what Yahweh says is right, even if it makes no sense. Like a 90-year-old guy and an 80-year-old woman is going to have a baby. How many 80-year-old women have babies? Do you think about that? How many 80-year-old women want a baby? Okay, next is in chapter 18. A lot more to say on these. Chapter 18, the Trinity comes to have lunch with Abram. It's an amazing story. But down in verse 18, God is thinking about the whole interaction with Sodom. This is Genesis 18:18. Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. That's just reiterating the Abrahamic covenant that we saw first back in chapter 12. And then 19, critical passage. For I have chosen him, Abraham, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, which is, in a word, is to obey. And in what way do you obey? You keep the way of the Lord by doing what? Tzedakah and mishpat, righteousness and justice. Those are that huge, they're basically synonyms, righteousness and justice. And if you're going to keep the way of Yahweh, you're going to keep tzedakah and mishpat, righteousness and justice. And we're going to look at what that means in just a minute. So that's the third dimension. What's the first dimension? You're what? Loyal. Second? Trust. You amen Yahweh. Third is what? Keep the way of Yahweh by doing tzedakah and mishpat. Just obey, basically. And then the third dimension, just to point out what it is in the fourth dimension is in Genesis 22. And you see in Genesis 22 the sacrifice of Isaac. When Abraham is sacrificing Isaac, it's on exactly the same mountain where the father is going to sacrifice the son 2,000 years later. And after the story comes up in verse 14, 22:14, Abraham called that place Yahweh Yireh, the Lord will provide. Now, the Lord has already provided a ram in place of Isaac. This is a prediction of what will happen on that mountain at Calvary when the Father will sacrifice the Son for our benefit. So the fourth dimension is look for the Lord to provide in Messiah. Okay, what are the four dimensions? First one is what? Loyal to Yahweh, even in Baal land, maybe even in America, who knows? Second, trust or amen. Third, keep the way of Yahweh, obey by doing what? Tzedakah and mishpat, righteous and justice. Fourth, look for Yahweh's provision in Messiah. He's learned this because he's been through this like 400 times already. So those are four dimensions. Now, let's look at an example of this in Zechariah. That's like the next to the last book of the Old Testament. In Zechariah, if you look at the heading in NIV of Zechariah 7, it says justice and mercy, not fasting. And it's talking about the fasts that they're doing. And after verse 8, this is Zechariah 7:8, and the word of the Lord came again to Zechariah. This is what the Lord Almighty said. And what did he say? Administer what? True justice, that's tzedakah, show mercy or grace, chen, and thirdly, compassion, raham, it's what a nursing mother does to a little baby. And then he has the quadrilateral. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the foreigner, or the poor. That's the quadrilateral of testing. Now, in an economy, these are worthless people. When I say they're worthless people, what do I mean? Pardon? They don't They don't add value. They're people who are net drainers from the economy. Working men, working young men, mothers, such, put something into the economy. These are people who are helpless in the economy. The widow, the orphan, the stranger, the person who's not from around here, doesn't have a relationship, and the poor. And what God said is treat them with justice. That's the basic command that comes in the Old Testament. There are many examples of that. I'm not going to unpack all of them. What I want to do is look specifically at a particular case of what we might call labor ethics. I want to look at a few passages. Let's start back in Deuteronomy. This is the last, Deuteronomy 24. This is Abraham's final speech to the people before he dies and they go into the land. Deuteronomy 24, it's just a reiteration of the law. And what I'd like you to do is look at Deuteronomy 24, 14 and 15. He's just summarizing laws. These appear in other places, but this is a good place to look at it. Deuteronomy 24, 14. It says this: do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset because they're poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. So what's he saying here? Pay the people that work for you. Pay them a timely wage. How come? Actually, it's more than that. It's not just that they're counting on it. It's more than that. What else is it? God's on their side. Now, in the normal economy, who do you expect God to be on the side of? The guy who's a net contributor to the economy. According to this, who is God on the side of? The side of the poor and the stranger. So when you oppress your worker, what he's saying here, Deuteronomy 24:14, he's saying when you oppress your worker, when you treat him unjustly, when you do not pay him a fair wage, God takes notice. And if God takes notice, that means you are guilty of sin. What should you do if you're guilty of sin? No, you don't repent. No, you don't repent. Scratch that. You don't repent. If you're guilty of sin, what should you do?
Stop?
No, you don't stop because it's profitable. I mean, you're making money off of it. If you're guilty of sin, what should you do? You guys have been taught in the wrong church, I can tell. If you're guilty of sin, but it's profitable, what should you do?
Do more of it.
Well, do more of it, but something else beyond that. Because you got to make things right with God, what should you do? Offer a sacrifice. What kind of a sacrifice would you offer here at Bridgetown? We got to be practical here, don't we? What kind of a sacrifice would you offer here at Bridgetown? Making coffee. That would be good. God would notice that you're over there making coffee for people, and they would be refreshed and warmed up on cold evenings, and God would say, you're good. Meanwhile, you're doing what? Do you see the silliness of what I'm saying? The thing is, we do it all the time. We try to do prayer or service in the church or, whatever, religious ritual, and God's not going to be satisfied with that. Let's look at an example. Who is the wisest man in the Bible other than Jesus? Solomon. Okay, let's look at Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 4. Solomon, good guy or bad guy? Many people put it as Solomon is a good guy that went bad. When you actually look at it, Solomon is flawed from the beginning, and those character flaws only get bigger as time goes on. What's the most famous story about Solomon? Well, that's later on. No, what's the story everybody tells in Sunday school? Yeah, the babies. Like, he's got to decide, you got one baby, two moms. What's he supposed to figure out? Which one owns it? And he does this crazy thing. Let's just cut the baby in half and give half to each mom. And one of the ones says, yeah, sounds fair to me. I can't imagine anybody actually saying that. And the other one says, no, give her to the other one. So he figures out who the mom is. Who are the mothers in that story? They're prostitutes. What you should say is, what in the world are prostitutes doing in the temple of God? Why should he be deciding between which prostitute has the baby? You should look at that and say, what is going on here? And we hold up as a model of wisdom, the deeper wisdom, why in the world are you tolerating prostitutes in the temple? That's what it is. Chapter 4. This is talking about Solomon's officials and governors. These are the government guys. So he names some of them. And then down in 1 Kings 4, let's see. I'm not seeing what I did. Oh, verse 20, 1 Kings 4:20. People of Judah and Israel, numerous sands of the sea, they drank and were happy. Solomon ruled all over the kingdoms from Euphrates River, the land of the Philistines, the border, and the country brought tribute, were Solomon's subject for all his life. Solomon's daily provisions were what? 30 cores of the finest flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 head of stall-fed calf. This is daily provisions. Do you see what's going on there? There's a lot of people there. Where does he get this money? The last of it, verse 27, the district governors, each in his month, supplied provisions for the king of Solomon, and all came to the king's table. How does he get this money to supply all this money for the king's household? He takes it from the people. What do we call that? Taxes. Okay? Now, keep going to chapter 5. Keep going to chapter 5. What is he doing in chapter 5? He's building the temple. Look at verse 13. How does Solomon build the temple? 1 Kings 5:13. How does he build the temple? He conscripts slaves from where? From the people of Israel. 30,000 men, sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. So he spent 1 month in Lebanon, 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers, 80,000 stone cutters in the hills, as well as, and it goes on. What are you thinking at this point? What do you think Solomon paid those people? Well, it doesn't sound like he paid them anything. What is he doing? He's using their labor to do what? Build a temple. Now, temple, good thing or bad thing? Good thing. Well done. Skip down to chapter 9. 1 Kings chapter 9. Well, sorry, let's start at chapter 7. What's he doing in chapter 7? He's building a palace. How long did it take him to build the palace? How long did it take him to build the temple? 7 years. Do you notice anything there? Almost twice as much time on his palace than on the temple of God. Interesting. And then I look at this, and it talks about all the stuff that's going on. Now go on to chapter 9. And if I look in chapter 9, Solomon's other activities, verse 15. Here's the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, his own palaces, the terraces, the walls, and all that kind of stuff. And it goes on and talks about that conscripted labor. And why is he building this fancy house? Didn't he inherit a house from his daddy? Who's his daddy? David. Good guy or bad guy? Mostly good guy. Hard after the Lord. Had a kind of a bad spell, but on the whole good. He inherits a nice house from his daddy. Why doesn't he live in that house? Look down at chapter 11. Chapter 11. Why does he not build Why does he not live in his own house? He's got a lot of wives. He's got a lot of wives. Who is his first wife, those your Bible geeks? Who is his first wife, Solomon's first wife? She is from where? Egypt. Good place or bad place? Bad place. Specifically told, do not get horses or women from Egypt. What's the first thing Solomon does? He goes and gets horses and a woman from Egypt. Now, what religion do you think a woman from Egypt might be involved in? Not the worship of Yahweh. And you look at this, how many wives does he have? 700 wives? And just in case they don't satisfy him, 300 concubines? No wonder he needed 13 years on his house. Can you imagine all the rivalry that go on between that many wives? Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 8. 2 Chronicles chapter 8. This is a parallel to the 1 Kings chapter 11. 2 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 11. Why does he need to build a house other than his daddy's house? 2 Chronicles 8:11. How come? 2 Chronicles 8:11. Why does he have to build another palace that he can't live in his daddy's nice house? What does it say there? 2 Chronicles 8:11. How come? Pardon? Why couldn't his wife live there? Because it's a holy place, and what does it say about his wife? She's not holy. She's not holy. She can't live in the temple. It probably says to me that she refuses to live in David's house. So he spends how many years building this palace? 13 years. And how does he do it? Slave labor. Slaves drawn from where? Everywhere. Israelites and foreigners. Good idea or bad idea? Look on down to 1 Kings chapter 12. We're almost done with our historic review. 1 Kings chapter 12. This is the beginning of his son's realm. Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the two sons, split things up, and I'm just really intrigued by what happens here. Verse 4, they come to Jeroboam and Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." What are the people asking for? Justice. Justice. They're asking for justice. This is Solomon, the son of David, and what is he doing? He is oppressing his workers. And see, that's the thing it is God is not okay with this. Oppressing the worker is just a seriously bad thing. Let's look at just a couple more passages and then I'll turn it back over. Look at Micah chapter 2. Look at Micah chapter 2. This is a real famous passage. Micah chapter 2. If I read it out loud, Micah chapter 2, verse 1, "Woe to those who plan iniquity, to those who plot evil in their beds. At the morning's light they carry it out because their power to do it. They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them. They defraud people of their homes and rob them of their inheritance." Here is what the Lord said when you do this kind of people. I am planning disaster against this people. What's it saying? God takes this very seriously. What's the last book in the Old Testament? Malachi, the Italian prophet. Malachi chapter 3. This is as he's beginning to hold up here, Malachi chapter 3. "I will send my message who will prepare the way before me." Who is that? We know now. Who is that? John the Baptist. Then suddenly the Lord you're seeking will come to his temple. Who is that? Was Messiah Jesus the first time, but it's also looking to a second time. The messenger of the covenant who you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who will stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites, refine them like gold and silver. Then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings of righteousness. The offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be accepted, Lord, as in the days gone by. How come? Verse 5. Note what he's saying. I will come to you, put you on trial. I will be quick to testify against sorcerers. What's that? That's people who get magic to manipulate the gods. Adulterers. What's that? Do I need to explain that here? Okay. Perjurers. What's that? Liars. Against those who what? Defraud laborers of their wages. Who oppress the widows and the fatherless and defy the foreigners among you of justice. But do not fear me, says the Lord Almighty. And then he says, I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. And the thing that strikes me, and the thing that I find is true in most of our places, is we think adultery, oh yeah, bad. Liars, yeah, that's bad. People who defraud folk of their wages is on the same list and just as bad. And that's why this economic justice thing is so important. It really matters to God. Is this only an Old Testament thing? Say no. Okay, thank you. Let's look at just one, just how many verses in the New Testament I want to do. Let's look at Luke 10:7. Luke 10:7. He's talking about this in Luke 10. He's talking about sending out the 72 on their mission. He says, don't take purse or bag or sandals. Do not greet anyone on the road. When you enter a house, say peace to the house, and so on. What do you say in Luke 10:7? Stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for what? A worker deserves his wages. Who said that? Jesus. It's not just an Old Testament thing, it's a whole Bible thing. And that's why when you look at this whole issue of economic justice, it's really, really, really important stuff. So, quick biblical foundation. We'll take more after Josh helps us understand more things.
Awesome. So, with that in mind, let's kind of zoom out for a moment and try to paint with really broad strokes in order to illustrate the issue for our purposes this evening. I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys. People way smarter and way more informed than me could fill up hours and hours of your time and still not kind of scratch the surface on what's going on here. So let's do our best with the time that we have. Do you know what a duvet is? What's a duvet? Yeah, it's like a comforter. It's a blanket, essentially. It's just a blanket. Why is it that folks like you and I know what a duvet is? Is this essential to our survival in the hunter-gatherer sense of the word? No. Tonight it is. We're consumers. We're byproducts of a lifestyle obsession. As consumers, we buy stuff. For the purposes of this expose, let's zero in on one thing that we all shop for to some extent, which is apparel, because it's the easy one. We purchase apparel. The apparel in question that we purchase was not burped out by a 3D printer yet. And it wasn't assembled, believe it or not, by machines on a conveyor belt yet. It's actually a 3-stage process. So it begins with farming, and that's the growing of cotton and the shearing of wool and what have you. Second, you have input production, which is like the cotton gins, the knitting, the dyeing, big machines, that kind of thing. And then final stage production is the actual cutting and sewing and printing. If you're wondering which of these 3 stages require actual human employees, the answer is, of course, all 3 of them. As such, The major apparel companies and retailers of the world inevitably require the efforts of hundreds and thousands of people to get what you're wearing, all the way from the cotton field or the sheep or the silkworm to the textile and the mill to the sewing machine and then into a shopping crate and then into the mall where you and I go and look and decide if we look good in it. And that's kind of where our concern begins and ends. Given the amount of manpower necessary in each stage of that threefold process in order to generate such a massive stockpile of clothes, companies, by and large, relegate these processes abroad, mostly to developing nations in order to ramp up production and save money in the process. Now, the fact that your clothes and my clothes were probably made overseas does not mean necessarily that they were produced unethically. Most of our clothes were made in China or in Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, and so on. The problem is that these companies don't simply have like a Forever 21 factory in China with the big Forever 21 sign on top and it's staffed and employed by Forever 21 employees. Rather, the company sources the production to cotton farmers and to mills and to factories, and then it falls on that company to sort of maintain insight into the areas in which they're sourcing those materials, to uphold the integrity of the farms and the mills and the factories that they work with, and more specifically to look after the people that work there. But often, they do not. Let's focus for a moment on the first stage of that threefold process we were talking about, farming, because this is an easy one. Sadly, it's convenient for us tonight, but the most appropriate and timely issue for the sake of this conversation is that of forced labor in the cotton fields of Uzbekistan. According to ongoing reports, readily accessible from a single Google search that anyone can do, have a blast. Each autumn, the government of Uzbekistan forcibly mobilizes hundreds of thousands of children, teachers, public servants, and private sector employees for the manual harvesting of cotton, meaning they send them out into the field and say, get to picking. According to surveys and rough calculations done in recent years, forced labor from children accounts for approximately half of the cotton picked during the harvest season in Uzbekistan. So school children, in some cases, in some reports, younger than 10 years old, are ordered away from their homes, away from school, to pick cotton. And these cotton pickers, they're not all kids, they're adults as well, are forced to work 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. They get a short break for lunch. Workers who don't live close to the harvest camp have to stay there, and it's very poor living conditions, as you might guess. It's including shortages of portable water, inadequate sanitation. Many suffer from malnutrition or a lack of access to basic medical treatment. And each day these workers are given a quota, a requirement for them to pick anywhere between 60 and 220 pounds of cotton. If their quota is not met, then they have to face the repercussions, and this is where we get lots and lots of reports of children being beaten for not meeting their quotas. Here is a sampling that I was really easily dug up from the Uzbek German Forum for Human Rights of reported incidents in the Uzbek cotton fields in just the last couple of years. They go way, way back, but these are the recent ones. One teen reported beatings when workers were faced with impossible quotas, saying, quote, "We ran away from the cotton field yesterday. There's no cotton left in the fields, but they gave us a 5-kilo daily target. Teachers summoned the students who couldn't pick the 5-kilo norm to the headquarter office and beat them. A couple of times we left the field without telling anyone, so they called us to the office. When we got there, without asking us any questions, they started beating us." One journalist who was tracking this firsthand, particular in a cotton district called Yakubag, apparently, which sounds like something from Star Wars, said, "When we were walking around the cotton districts today, we witnessed that mainly young children were picking cotton in the fields by the roads. There were about 10 children. One of the girls, a 5th grade student, said that she and her peers were taken from school since the cotton season started and have been picking cotton since then." At another point, a 53-year-old worker told activists, quote, Cotton helpers have not left the fields yet, and this is after the season had ended. They are still in the fields. Everyone is still picking cotton. It has gotten even tougher. The plan has been fulfilled in the region, district, and even in the entire country, but there are no signs of returning the workers to their homes. According to this information provided by the district mayor's office and the internal affairs office, last year a 19-year-old cotton picker was beaten to death by police officers when attempting to leave the cotton fields before meeting his quota. So all that to say, the situation is obviously quite dire. And this is just one example of one situation and one step of that threefold process. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going from this, or where I'm going with this. Where does the cotton used by a tremendous amount of major clothing manufacturers come from? Uzbekistan. In some instances, companies are kind of twice removed from the actual source. So this is the case with Daewoo International. You probably recognize the name as like a manufacturer of cars. It's this really weird, huge conglomerate, and it's also the largest processor of cotton in Uzbekistan. So Daewoo is one of only a handful of companies left that has defied an international call to stop using Uzbek cotton that has been harvested using forced labor. So in response to this, campaigns launched by activists and organizations like antislavery.org put pressure and petitions and emails and visits on apparel companies to sever ties with Daewoo and kind of cut them off at the source. Those companies have reacted in one of two ways, and these are just two easy examples. You can read about a ton of the companies who are kind of involved in this controversy. An example of the first reaction is H&M, who's right down the road at Pioneer Place. In response to campaigns and hundreds of emails sent by anti-slavery supporters, H&M, in measures enacted as recently as last year, now requires that direct suppliers sign a commitment to not use Uzbek cotton. In addition, H&M has asked its 300 most important fabric suppliers to stop sourcing Uzbek cotton. They've made a commitment to stop doing business with direct suppliers and strategic fabric mills that do not stop sourcing Uzbek cotton. And they have promised to conduct random checks to ensure compliance, that all these measures are met. Now, obviously, that's not something that they flip a switch and it's fixed, but they're moving from one place to another in the right direction. On the other side of the spectrum, you have, and forgive me for this, it's just the easiest example, Nike, which sources synthetics from Daewoo. And they have to date refused to end their relationship with Daewoo International. Campaigns and petitions urging Nike to join H&M in cutting ties with Daewoo, instituting new preventative measures are in effect as we speak. You can go sign one right now. They're everywhere. What's shocking and complicated about the scenario is now we can see kind of how far back it reaches. We're not talking about, in this case, the store and what goes on in the store. We're not even talking about just about what's going on in the factory where the clothes are getting made or the mill where the fabric was processed. We're talking about the actual fields where the cotton was grown that has to then jump over all these obstacles to get in the form of clothes and get to you. These companies, with their long arms, are reaching so far back and so far away from, the actual pair of shoes, and they're the ones who are paying for this labor. So they're the ones that are keeping these systems of slavery in business, as it were. And in past years, having any insight into this kind of thing at all was nearly impossible. Each company's vested interest is obviously in preserving its own financial stability and thus its reputation. So a company like H&M, they may not care, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they do, but they may not actually care whether or not they have child slaves in their employ. What they care about is whether or not Joe Shopper knows about those things and whether or not that will affect if you and I will go spend money there. But given the ever-increasing wealth of information that we now all have access to via the internet, coupled with the growing awareness of issues like these and folks willing to call iffy practices into question, companies are becoming less and less capable of pulling the proverbial wool over our eyes. They can still do it, it's a lot harder for them. So for a bit of specific perspective, let's take a look at a couple of reports that I read that were so boring. But I got the results from them. That's what we need for tonight. So freetowork.org, which is a wonderful site. I'll tell you guys more about it in a second. They did this exhaustive study, an apparel industry trends report, compiled data on over 50 major companies based on the following factors. So the company's policies, whether or not that company even has anything on the books that says we shouldn't have slaves in our employ. So let's watch out for that. Their traceability and transparency, so how public they are with their successes and failures, their continued efforts toward ethical labor, and then monitoring and training, how hands-on they are in keeping up with their production partners abroad, and finally, the obvious one, workers' rights. So based on that in-depth study, Free to Work then assigned each of those companies in question a grade, A, B, C, D, or F, just like you get in school. They mean the same thing. Now, according to the site, these scores represent the most comprehensive picture of the systems within the industry that often lead to forced labor or child labor in particular. Now, based on this report, here are just a small handful of well-known companies that received passing grades. Adidas, Gap, H&M, Levi's, Patagonia, Timberland, and Puma all got A's or B's, or even a C in some cases across those fields. Good for you guys. Way to go. And then on the failing list, we had Aeropostale, Carter's, Forever 21, Skechers, Express, Fruit of the Loom, Lacoste, Quicksilver, Walmart, surprise, Abercrombie, American Eagle, Arc'teryx, Disney, for some reason, and Gildan, for those of you that are buying t-shirts in bulk and don't care about whether or not they're any good. Enough people got that joke to know that? Yeah, Gildan are awful shirts. Let's look at one more study. This one was published earlier this year, and an organization called Responsible Sourcing Network conducted a survey of corporate practices to end forced labor. Now, this study ranked 49 companies by assigning them a maximum of 100 points across 11 indicators in the categories of policy, public disclosure, engagement, and implantation. So much like the one before it. In that study, and this was really interesting to me, only 5 of those near 50 companies scored over 50 points out of 100. And those 5 were Adidas, IKEA, Levi's, Patagonia, Calvin Klein. Way to go. Those were the only guys who made it above the halfway point. Some of them very high. I think Adidas and IKEA were the top 2. Meanwhile, Nike and Nordstrom scored a failing 29 out of 100. Macy's got a 23. American Eagle got a 12. Gymboree got a 7.5. And listen to this. Costco, Bed Bath & Beyond, Sears, and Forever 21 all scored below 5 points. Some of them only made 2. And this is the best part. Urban Outfitters got a big fat 0. And so we could really do this all night. I mean, I read like 10 of these things. Man, are they long. And then you get to the end, and there's the grades. You're like, oh, I should have just skipped ahead, I guess. But I just wanted to give you a sample of the conversation that's going on. And either way, it puts us at a bit of a crossroads. Because what the heck do you do with all this? I mean, that's a lot of information really fast, and there's a lot more. What do you do with this? In the interest of full disclosure, and John Mark said this from the outset, the idea here is not to give you guys a definitive list of do's and don'ts. I mean, those were scores on companies, but some of those companies still have some good things that they do, and some of them have no good things at all. But it's more complicated than just one simple grade from one simple study. I think you guys can obviously put that together. So we're not after a definitive list and do's and don'ts, do buy this, don't buy that. But we do think that there are a handful of things that are clear or at least practical in going forward from here. Before we get there, let me tell you just a tiny bit about where I am personally with all this and how I got there. About 5 years ago, I think, I read a story about an Indonesian kid who had this violent-looking scar drawn down the length of his face. And the author of this account had met this Indonesian boy while attending a rally against overseas sweatshops. And this child had been brought in to speak because he, at some point in his life, was trafficked into forced labor. And when asked about the scar, the boy said that his master had lashed him in the face when he wasn't working hard enough. And his master didn't want him to stop working, and he didn't want him to bleed all over the fabric, so he took a lighter and he burned the wound shut. And now he has this awful, heinous scar on his face. Obviously, I didn't meet this kid. You know, the book that I read this in was a credible source, I think, but I have no way of knowing 100% how true it is. I can't verify the validity of the account or track the company that the kid was working for. But it made me think, what if I could? What if I could see that scar with my own eyes and hear that kid's voice and see the other boys and girls that must have been abused in the same way, if this is true? What if I could see all of that stuff and I discovered that it was behind the curtain of the purchases that I make? Would I still make them? If these establishments, be they, Nike or Forever 21 or Apple or Starbucks or whoever you want to put under the microscope, if the stores were connected to the factories and the walls were made of glass, and I saw with my own eyes the injustice, the abuse of children or whatever it is, over the shoulder of the clerk as I reach out to hand over my debit card, would I still hand it over? Or is it just ignorance is bliss? And what does Jesus think about that? If we could see abuse and injustice that might stain our clothes or our coffee or our electronics or our entertainment, would it change the way that we shop? How much of it would we need to see? So, after reading that story and just thinking about it a little bit, I made a decision personally. And that was to start with doing better research, to not go into purchases blindly. And for me, I decided to not financially support companies whose reputations are in question as it pertains to slave labor, child labor, and human trafficking. Meaning, before I buy something, I try to investigate the company to the best of my ability. Sometimes that's quite easy. Sometimes you can find nothing. If I can't find any sources, either from the company themselves or elsewhere, that claim the company's products were produced ethically, I forego the purchase. If I discover that the company has been exposed for questionable practices at some point, but the data is unclear or the company is silent on the matter, then I kind of do the better safe than sorry thing and I forego the purchase. Now, silence, of course, on a company's behalf or just in general does not imply guilt per se. That's obvious. This is just my personal methodology. At the end of the day, we're talking about stuff. So at the very worst, I'm buying less stuff, which for me is a win any way you slice it, because I need to buy less stuff. The risk associated with not buying is not that significant. So this does not mean that I've achieved all this with effortless perfection. Sadly, the issue of injustice in labor, and based on what Gerry's talking about, it extends well beyond the obvious, Walmarts of the world and into things like chocolate and coffee and factory farms and on and on and on the list it goes. I just decided to start somewhere and to try. I suspect that I've violated my own treaty without even knowing it from time to time. You see something that you need, you buy it, and then all of a sudden you think, wait a minute, where the heck did this come from? I didn't even think about that. It's easy when you're thinking about obvious things like tennis shoes or your jacket. It's not as obvious when you buy a bag of M&Ms or something like that. What about if my own manifesto sort of contradicts itself? Like I said, the potential for injustice lurking behind the things we purchase and consume goes beyond our clothes and into our refrigerators and our medicine cabinets and our electronics and our entertainment. And so it's complicated. You can't just, or at least I wasn't able to from the outset just say like, here's my brand new list of approved things and now I know how to shop. It's a tremendous amount of trial and error. What about when it's not easy? For me, not buying certain clothes is easy because I don't care about clothes. But what about when it becomes difficult? For instance, I obviously have a MacBook. This isn't actually mine. I was given this for work if you want to judge me. But has an Apple, for example, been exposed for horrific Chinese factory conditions in the past? Yes, they actually have. And there was a time when that was the first big thing for me because I like to use Apple products in a pragmatic sense and in a materialistic sense. Go ahead. And I had to ask myself whether or not this was going to be the last one that I ever had. So I applied my process. It began the investigation. I found right away that Apple does have in place a public policy that claims the company is, I wrote it down here, quote, committed to the highest standard of human rights. Great. That doesn't mean that's true. So what else you got? Even now, if you go on Apple's website, you can find interactive reports on Apple's continued effort to eradicate unethical hiring and the exploitation of workers. In fact, the data goes much farther in its effort to prove Apple's commitment to making incidents like the ones that have been widely reported in the past a thing of the past. Much like H&M, it seems like when you go and you read, Apple has been in one situation and is trying to move this way away from that situation and is providing the public with sources to see how they are doing that. But those efforts make far less interesting headlines than, suicide in iPad factory. So we don't read about them as readily as we do the latter, or the former. Either way you slice it, I have no way of knowing for sure. Thing is, both of those sources have an agenda. Apple's is, of course, to protect its reputation so that it can sell products, obviously. That's its whole thing. The news media's agenda is, to keep us all terrified of the world and profit from our fear like Monsters Incorporated. So, which of these two sources will I choose to believe? And then there are other companies with similarly distressing incidents in the media, but without any benefit of any defense from the company, without a public policy in place or interactive reports that you can download, without any espoused measures to rectify the problem in question. And this is in a time where CEOs are being tasked to visit their own factories and they say no, and when major chains scoff at the notion of going the way of ethically produced products. So to me, a gesture of publicly pursued repentance like Apple's, even if it isn't, bam, we fixed all the issues, but at least we're going in this direction, is quite refreshing. Nowadays, you don't even have to settle for that. Many companies are doing even better. Within the last few years, establishments, like I mentioned, H&M and now even Target, have come forward to confess that even if it costs more for the company and the consumer, they are committed to rooting out issues of labor injustice inherent in their systems. And I kind of think that the longer any semblance of social awareness or even slacktivism remain in vogue, the more big retailers will count the cost of not offering ethically manufactured products. I think that eventually, and the sources that I consulted on this sort of agreed, sweatshops will become like the new MSG or the new trans fat, where it's a thing, we don't really know what it means, but we know it's bad. So they want to have a sticker on there that says sweatshop free, and that's a win for us. And in the meantime, how do we shop? In my experience, when you bring up this conversation and you ask this question, you typically happen upon two reactions. The first reaction is what I call the disposition of forfeit. So a consumer faced with the gravity of their shopping decisions and the often frustrating lack of easy answers or the ambiguity of it all, or most importantly, the disappointment of finding out that their favorite company is on the naughty list, they simply concede and they quit and they shop wherever they want. It can't be done perfectly, so why try at all? That's a popular one. The second reaction I often experience is what I call the lawyer in the loophole. In this paradigm, any argument that expunges the responsibility of the shopper can and should be used as a license to shop wherever we want. For instance, the argument that I'm making, that I'm saying personally I've decided not to finance companies guilty of enslaving children and so forth, is based on, in theory, my desire to follow Jesus. At least that's what I'm saying. You're going to have to trust me on that. But all secular companies are in some way, shape, or form guilty of neglecting the way of Jesus, as they, by definition, do not set out to follow the way of Jesus as a company. Whether this manifests itself in, like the immoral behavior of a CEO, or sexualized advertisements, or simply partnering with other organizations that contradict the way of Jesus, all of this should, by my logic, disqualify these companies from our support. And yet we do not avoid all companies, so why avoid any of them? And this is actually a fair argument. It's one that I think has some serious weaknesses. In my personal estimation, a sleazy CEO or a questionable billboard are simply not the same thing as a child trafficked into slavery to stitch together the actual shoes on my feet. And feel free to disagree, but as I see it personally, questionable practices in terms of moral behavior within a company are something of or can be something of a gray area in which each follower of Jesus is within their own prerogative to make certain calls about how they will or will not support a given company. Purchasing a product an abused child was forced to make is less of a gray area to me. And make no mistake, even though I'm kind of being stark about that, this is obviously a tremendously complicated issue. When we bring up even the word sweatshops, which is, the name of the night, the conversation encompasses much more than clear issues of biblical injustice, like Gerry was talking about, the abuse of women and children, not paying workers. We also broach more subjective subjects like fair wages. We're not just talking about no wages at all, but what is a fair wage, adequate working conditions, not deplorable, but adequate working conditions, the economical influence of the countries in which our stuff is manufactured. It's all extremely complicated. Because of this, there is no simple buy local solution. Some countries are simply better at growing coffee than we are. They have the weather and atmosphere, soil, I don't know, I'm not a coffee farmer, but some of them apparently are way better at it than we are. Some countries are a better fit for manufacturing clothing than we are, even if injustice isn't involved at all. And I've chosen a route and a methodology, but it isn't the only route. And when we agree on the basics, there still follows a hefty serving of deliberation. What I am suggesting this evening for your consideration are three possible methodologies for you to adopt or adapt or take some or one of the other, all of which in my personal estimation are a step away from the disposition of forfeit or the lawyer and the loophole and toward awareness and justice. So first, option is simply to reject ignorance. Now, this lifestyle change is the least scary because you're not committing to an entirely new way of shopping just yet, and that's okay. What you are saying is that you will, as long as you continue to shop, you will also continue to learn. So gone in this situation is the option of behaving as though the issues we're discussing this evening don't exist. Clothes are no longer just clothes. They often come with the heavy baggage of serious oppression and injustice, and we're saying we would like to know more about that as we shop. Simple enough. The second methodology is just simple discretion. And this follows from the commitment to learn more, but comes with the commitment to make changes if need be. Maybe just starting with the things that seem really clear to you, and that might be different from person to person, but any one of us can investigate the places that we regularly shop. You might have a hard time finding information in one place. Chances are, if you look at all of them, you're going to learn something. And I'm afraid many of us will probably discover that at least one or two of those places might have some very unambiguous issues that don't sit well with us. So more discretion doesn't mean a hardcore boycott or wearing a potato sack or, you have to have dreadlocks or anything like that. It just means taking a step forward and actively changing a shopping decision or two. And finally, there's the ever-intimidating third option, abstinence, which is the hardcore, guilty until proven innocent disposition of not making any purchases until you have reasonable confidence that it will not support child abuse or slavery. If you consider pursuing any of those three options, or one like them, if you want to mix and match or kind of adapt one for your own purposes, then I have personally, just from Josh, a handful of strategies that will make your life easier. The first thing is this: stick with trusted companies. If you want to try any of these things, do enough research to find a reputable place to shop, and when in doubt, shop there. People often tease me when I talk about this kind of thing because they say, easy for you to say you wear the same outfit every day. And that's true. I went to H&M and I got some black shirts and black jeans and I'm good to go. You might like some more options than that, and that's fine. Lucky for you, there are more options than just H&M, and they're not all that difficult to find. So find something you like and stick with it. You can also shop secondhand. When you buy old clothes from a thrift store, or if you even want to go to the trendy thrift stores here in Portland that charge you way more money for the same junk, your no new funds are going back into the original company, so it's almost like a free-for-all. use your best judgment. For example, my wife really wanted to get our son Beck a pair of, the little cute little All-Stars, the little Converse All-Stars. We don't personally buy anything from Nike, who makes Converse, so she found a used pair online. They've or a used pair online, not in the sense that like some seller was selling 10 boxes of them, but like an actual mom had her kid wear them and now wants to get rid of them. So they're scuffed up, they're not new, but they get the job done. Secondhand works. And finally, and this is my favorite one, you can always just buy less stuff. How many of us really need the junk that we buy? And believe me, I'm talking about myself when I talk about this as well. Even if you do need something, how many of us need it to come from the places that we shop? That doesn't mean that all shopping is inherently evil. It's not. Or that you should feel guilty about buying clothes or whatever it is you have. That's not what I'm saying at all. It just means that buying less stuff is very rarely bad advice. Now, all that said, let me be abundantly clear again in reiterating that this is food for thought. This is a conversation starter. This is not a church position. This is not a sign up. We're not going to make anyone stand up. Or it's not even a call to action per se. But at the end of the day, what is all this talk and all this deliberation over? Stuff. It's just stuff. If we feel as though we need a certain pair of shoes or a certain type of phone or computer so badly that the thought of not buying it, even if it avoids supporting slavery, scares us, or if we might suspect that the thing we want to buy or own might indeed be the product of injustice and we remain irresolute in giving it up, it's just not worth it to us, then I think maybe that speaks to an issue deeper than simply where the stuff we buy came from. And whatever you take from this evening, if you'd permit me to be a bit heavy-handed for just a moment, however you react to this, it isn't something that we as followers of Jesus should ignore. Yes, it's complicated, and yes, it's challenging and convicting and all that stuff, but it should not be ignored. I'm often taken aback by the way that we in the church, in particular in Portland, and honestly, I have been guilty of this myself, absolutely, but we'll really go after certain issues and ignore the fact that what we have on might be supporting the thing that we're rallying against. If you're rallying against sex trafficking, and you should be, but the shoes on your feet were sewn together by children trafficked into slavery, something seems off. Or if you have your fists in the air and you're so upset about the oppression of women, and you should be, but your jacket was stitched together by women forced to work under the tyranny of slave masters, something seems a bit off. At the end of all this, I'd be remiss if I implied that what I'm after is you adopting my methodology or even one like it or my 3 suggestions or anything like that. I would much rather move us, me included, away from dogma and toward compassion and awareness. So it's not about guilt or rules or a stigma. It's not even about going Amish or whatever. It's about remembering our brothers and sisters that we can't see, the ones who made the stuff that we buy. It's like Gerry said, God is on their side. And it's about caring for those people more deeply than we care about our stuff. Something I found myself thinking a lot when I first started to read about this kind of thing was I had no idea. I had no idea that it went so far and that it was so hopelessly tethered to so much of the stuff that I want or that I buy. And sadly, I think this is kind of an area in the church where we've been reticent in making bold strides. So if there are things that Jesus would have us know and to have us say and to have us do and to change, then ought we not to learn and to speak out and to act and to make those changes? And as scary and frustrating as it often is when Jesus wants access to our wallets and our spending habits and the behaviors that compel our spending, if we're his disciples, don't we want his way more than we want ours, even if it's scary to actually say, Jesus, do you want me to buy this thing? Because we know what he'll probably say. So we're going to attempt a Q&A thing before we end here, but I have some final resources for you guys that I think might be helpful, a few pragmatic pieces as we continue the conversation. These are some websites that have been extremely beneficial to me over the last few years, and even in preparing a lot of this data that I talked about tonight. So freetowork.org is my favorite one. They actually also have an app for your phone that lets you scan barcodes and see a company's score based on all the research that Free to Work has done at this point. So not every single company is represented, but a tremendous amount of companies are, and the information is actually tremendously helpful. It's not vague, and they have sources that can back up what they're saying. I think the app might be out of the store for a second when I was looking because they're updating it or something, but it'll be back. The site itself has a tremendous amount of resources and educational materials that you can read and get updated on. If you want to go even deeper, the workersrights.org is the Workers' Rights Consortium, and it actually allows you to learn about brands based on factory evaluations, often spanning years and years and years. So you can go on, pick a year, pick a company, download a factory report, and say, this is what we saw when we went to their factory. Laborrights.org is the home of the International Labor Rights Forum. That's a hub of resources, educational materials, as well as sweatfree.org, freetheslaves.net, and antislavery.org. All tremendous resources for not only learning more, but looking into the stuff that you buy and finding whatever it is that's out there for you to know. And as rudimentary as this sounds, often a simple Google search can prove quite revelatory. If you're searching the company name along with sweatshops or labor policy or slavery or forced labor, things like that, you'll probably get a lot of hearsay and a lot of rumors, but every now and then you'll actually conjure up some actual data that's very helpful. So I wouldn't rule that out. More importantly, let's bring this conversation to Jesus, who should have veto power over all our shopping decisions, whatever they might be. And let's continue to seek the way of Jesus and ask him to lead us to a place of wisdom in our purchases that both honors him and our brothers and sisters behind the curtain of the purchases that we make here. Do any of you guys off the top of your head have anything that comes to mind as a question?